Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today is this: DARVO, when accountability gets reversed. This is Direct Action Mailbag 0008, and the question behind it is difficult because it sits right on top of one of the most vulnerable places in leadership. A first-line supervisor identifies conduct that needs to be corrected. The supervisor checks the facts, addresses the employee, documents what happened, and reports the concern through the proper chain. Then the person being corrected denies the conduct, attacks the supervisor, and tells senior leadership that the supervisor is actually the aggressor. Now, the supervisor who raised the concern is defending their tone, motives, leadership style, prior decisions, and entire professional identity, while the original conduct remains unresolved. That is not a normal disagreement. It is not simply two people who need to communicate better. It can break the accountability process, weaken the manager's authority, teach the team that correction can be defeated by counteraccusation, and condition capable leaders to stop leading because the personal cost of enforcing the standard becomes too high. The listener asked how mid-level and senior managers should identify and handle this pattern. That is still the leadership question. But I want to begin one level lower with the person standing inside the reversal, because that is where the human damage begins. I respect the first-line leader who brought this question forward. This is not somebody asking how to avoid being challenged. This is somebody who identified a problem, tried to address it, and then watched the entire situation turn around. They were expected to hold the standard. They attempted to hold the standard. Then the act of holding the standard became the accusation against them. That can leave a leader angry, embarrassed, isolated, and unsure of their own judgment. They replay every conversation, email, coaching decision, and word choice. They wonder whether the conduct was serious enough to raise, whether they were too direct, and whether the entire conflict exists because they confronted something that would have been easier to ignore. That self-questioning is not proof that the original concern was weak. It may be evidence that the accountability process has been displaced. The direct answer is this: do not decide who is right based on who sounds calmer, who appears more offended, who holds more authority, who has better internal relationships, or who produces the strongest counter-accusation. Preserve the original concern, separate the original allegation from the response to it, stabilize any immediate safety, compliance, financial, personnel, customer, or operational risk, reconstruct the sequence, preserve the evidence, investigate the original conduct and any legitimate counter-complaint as separate issues. Protect the reporting person and witnesses from retaliation. Correct what the evidence supports. Then address tone, communication, aggression, insubordination, or other behavior through its own defensible process. Do not investigate the supervisor's reaction in place of the conduct that produced it. That does not mean behavior is irrelevant. It means behavior cannot be used to erase sequence, evidence, ownership, or accountability. That is the controlling point for this entire mailbag. DARVO succeeds inside an organization when leadership allows the counterattack to replace the complaint. The person facing accountability does not have to prove the original concern is false. They only have to create enough emotion, confusion, reputational pressure, and competing accusation that leadership stops examining the thing that started the process. The original conduct becomes a personality dispute. The performance issue becomes a question about management style. The documented standard becomes an accusation of targeting. The correction becomes retaliation. The supervisor who raised the concern becomes the person under investigation. Once that happens, accountability has been reversed. Before we go further, I want to keep the language accurate. DARVO stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. The term was introduced by psychologist Jennifer Freed to describe a response pattern that can appear when someone is confronted about wrongdoing. The person denies the conduct, attacks the person doing the confronting, and reverses the roles so the accused person presents as the injured party while the person raising the concern is recast as the offender. DARVO is not a medical diagnosis. It is not proof that the original allegation is true. It is not permission to label every defensive employee as manipulative, abusive, narcissistic, or dishonest. A person is allowed to deny an allegation. A person is allowed to dispute the evidence. A person is allowed to say that a supervisor treated them unfairly. A person may be falsely accused. A supervisor may handle a legitimate correction badly. A countercomplaint may be real. The leader's responsibility is not to diagnose the person. The leader's responsibility is to recognize when the response pattern is disrupting the accountability process and restore control to the evidence. That distinction matters because sloppy use of the term creates its own failure. If a manager hears one denial and says, "That is DARVO," the manager has already prejudged the case. If the reporting supervisor uses the label to avoid answering legitimate questions about their conduct, the label becomes another shield. If human resources treats the pattern itself as proof of guilt, the organization has replaced one weak assumption with another. The right use of DARVO is not as a verdict. It is a warning signal. The warning is that the original issue may be disappearing beneath denial, personal attack, role reversal, emotional force, and a new narrative about who the real victim is. Gaslighting may appear inside that attack. The employee may try to convince the supervisor that the conduct never happened, that the supervisor misunderstood what they saw, or that the correction is proof the supervisor is unstable or personally motivated. But gaslighting and DARVO are not interchangeable. Gaslighting attacks a person's confidence in their perception. DARVO reverses the accountability structure. One can support the other, but they are not the same thing. This is not a generational diagnosis. Current research does not establish that one generation is uniquely affected. The more useful leadership question is whether power, status, relationships, or institutional protection are influencing whose story receives attention. Let me put you inside a realistic operating situation. Maya is a first-line supervisor in a customer operations center. Her team handles service failures, customer commitments, open case follow-up, and final case closure. The work is visible. Complaint volume is rising. A major client has questioned the organization's response time. Senior leadership wants the open backlog reduced before the next executive review. The team is tired, the numbers are receiving attention, and every case left open feels like another signal that the operation is falling behind. One of Maya's employees, Derek, is experienced, well-liked, and confident in front of senior leaders. He understands the system and has a reputation for moving work quickly. Over several weeks, his closure numbers improve faster than the rest of the team's. His backlog shrinks. His dashboard looks clean. Then customer callbacks begin landing in other queues. Cases are marked resolved, even though commitments remain open. Others are moved into categories that no longer appear in the primary backlog report. The dashboard shows closure. The operation still carries the work. The dashboard had declared victory. The customers had not been consulted. Maya does not immediately accuse Derek of manipulating the numbers. The system is imperfect. Status definitions can be unclear, and teams sometimes develop informal workarounds. So Maya checks the case history, timestamps, customer notes, open commitments, and status changes. She compares Derek's closures with the work still required and confirms the written standard. Then she identifies a repeatable pattern. Cases are being closed before the required customer action is complete. The work is not disappearing. It is moving outside the primary report. Maya schedules a private conversation with Derek. She explains what she found. She shows him several examples. She asks him to walk through the records. She gives him room to explain whether the system, the procedure, the training, or the workload contributed to the problem. That is what responsible first-line leadership should look like. Derek denies doing anything wrong. He says the closure definitions are vague. He says everyone handles cases that way. He says Maya is focused on technical details instead of customer outcomes. He says he is being punished for working efficiently. Some of that may be true. The standard may be unclear. Other employees may be doing the same thing. A supervisor may need to inspect the wider process before assigning individual responsibility. Maya asks for the examples supporting his explanation. She tells him the affected cases still need to be reviewed. She restates the current closure requirement until leadership decides whether the procedure needs to change. That is when the response turns. Derek says she has been looking for a reason to discipline him. He says she is threatened by experienced employees. He says she resents the fact that senior leaders know his work. He tells coworkers that Maya is targeting him because he challenged her staffing decisions several months earlier. Then he files a complaint with Maya's manager, Priya, and Human Resources. He says Maya created a hostile work environment. He says her meeting was aggressive. He says she embarrassed him by questioning his integrity. He says the case review is retaliation for disagreeing with her. He says he no longer feels safe meeting with her alone. He provides several direct emails from Maya asking for status updates and missed follow-up. He says the tone proves she has been building a case against him. Now Priya receives two different streams. Maya is reporting that customer cases may have been closed before required work was completed. Derek is reporting that Maya is targeting, bullying, and retaliating against him. Priya has real responsibilities to both people. She cannot assume the supervisor is right because the supervisor holds authority. She cannot dismiss Derek's complaint because it appeared after a performance correction. She cannot allow Maya to use her position to punish someone for raising a legitimate concern. She cannot allow the customer operation problem to continue if the records are accurate. The pressure is real. Human Resources wants the relationship stabilized. Senior leadership wants the backlog corrected without another employee relations problem. Derek says he is distressed and wants immediate protection. Maya is angry, defensive, and trying to explain several weeks of case history while also answering questions about her tone. Within days, the center of gravity moves. The original question was whether customer cases were closed before the required work was complete. The new question becomes whether Maya is fit to supervise. Human Resources begins reviewing her emails. Priya asks whether Maya has always been too direct. Coworkers are interviewed about her management style. Someone mentions that she interrupted Derek in a team meeting 3 months earlier. Another employee says Maya can become intense when customer commitments are missed. A prior disagreement about scheduling is pulled into the record, and meanwhile the case closures remain unresolved. The customer commitments still exist. The procedure may still be unclear. The dashboard may still be inaccurate. But leadership is now building a character picture around Maya. Notice what did not happen. No one formally concluded that Maya's concern was false. No one completed the case audit. No one proved that Derek's closures met the standard. No one established that Maya's communication or raised the need to examine the records. Leadership simply began moving toward the issue that was easier to understand emotionally and safer to address politically. Correcting a supervisor's tone feels manageable. Determining whether an experienced employee manipulated customer records feels harder. So the organization starts solving Maya, and this is where the decision gets so stupid it becomes visual. The unresolved customer cases are sitting in the lobby with numbered tickets while a committee puts Maya's punctuation on trial. The visual is ridiculous. The operating failure is not. The work is still open, the data is still unreliable, and leadership has changed defendants without answering the first question. And that is the moment I want you to stay with, because this is where the human part becomes larger than the process diagram. Maya goes home and begins replaying the meeting. She remembers the exact moment Derek became defensive. She wonders whether she leaned forward too aggressively. She rereads the email where she wrote, "I need the affected cases corrected by Friday." The sentence looks different now that Human Resources has asked about it. She remembers using the phrase, "this cannot continue," and wonders whether that sounds threatening outside the context of repeated customer failure. She starts thinking through every correction she has given Derek. Was she harder on him because he was more experienced? Did she assume intent too quickly? Did she allow her frustration with the customer complaints to influence her tone? Did she create the appearance of retaliation by reviewing his work after he challenged a staffing decision? Those are responsible questions. A leader should inspect their own conduct. Authority does not make a supervisor automatically right. A person can identify a real problem and still handle the conversation poorly. But Maya's self-review begins moving beyond responsible reflection. She starts wondering whether she should withdraw the original concern so the investigation will stop. She considers accepting a coaching statement that says the problem was mutual communication. She thinks about apologizing for the entire event, not because the records were wrong, but because the personal pressure has become exhausting. She worries that Priya no longer trusts her. She worries that Human Resources has already decided she is the problem. She worries that the team thinks she targeted Derek. She worries about her next performance review, her future assignments, and whether every decision she makes from this point forward will be treated as evidence of retaliation. The original customer issue has now entered her home, her sleep, her confidence, and her identity as a leader. That is what Mailbag 0007 taught us about gripping leadership problems. The operating failure matters. The system matters. The process matters. But the reason people connect is because somebody has to carry the consequence in their body, their career, their family time, and their sense of who they are. In Mailbag 0007, competence became the punishment. The strongest employee kept inheriting the burden because leadership knew she would carry it. Here, accountability becomes the punishment. The supervisor does what the organization claims it wants. She sees the problem, addresses it, documents it, and raises it. Then the correction itself becomes the evidence used against her. That realization hurts. You spend years learning how to lead people fairly. You try to give clear expectations. You try to document decisions. You try to avoid humiliating people. You try to separate behavior from identity. You try to protect the customer, the team, and the standard. Then one counter-complaint makes every one of those choices look suspicious. Now, the organization asks whether you are too direct, too controlling, too rigid, too emotional, too defensive, or too invested in being right. The employee's conduct becomes one event. Your leadership identity becomes the entire investigation. That is the reversal. Research on DARVO matters because the pattern can influence both the person confronting the conduct and the audience judging the conflict. Greater exposure has been associated with increased self-blame, while third parties may begin viewing the reporting person as less credible and more responsible. That is why senior leaders cannot treat growing uncertainty or presentation quality as evidence. The person using the reversal may sound calm. They may use the right language. They may frame the issue around fairness, safety, culture, retaliation, or dignity. They may present a clean story with a clear villain. The reporting supervisor may sound worse. They may be angry. They may be exhausted. They may provide too many documents. They may answer one question by explaining 5 connected events because they are trying to recover the sequence in real time. They may interrupt because they feel the original issue disappearing. They may become defensive because their entire professional identity is now being examined. Do not mistake composure for truth. Do not mistake distress for guilt. Do not mistake confidence for evidence. Do not mistake a senior title for credibility. The evidence has to carry the decision. This is where a weak leader says, there are problems on both sides before determining what either problem is. That sentence sounds balanced. It sounds mature. It sounds like a leader refusing to take sides. But balance without sequence can become cowardice dressed up as fairness. There may be problems on both sides. Maya may have communicated too aggressively. Derek may have a legitimate complaint. The closure standard may be weak. The workload may be unreasonable. Priya may need to correct several conditions. The mistake is treating those issues as if they began at the same time, answer the same question, carry the same evidence, and create the same risk. They do not. One issue concerns whether customer cases were closed before the required work was completed. Another concerns whether Maya handled the correction appropriately. Another concerns whether Derek's complaint contains legitimate allegations. Another concerns whether Derek used the complaint process to redirect scrutiny, pressure witnesses, or damage Maya's reputation. Another concerns whether Priya and Human Resources allowed the original operating issue to disappear. Those streams can interact, they still have to be separated. DARVO gains power when sequence is flattened. Once everything becomes one pile called conflict, the person with the stronger presentation, better relationships, higher status, or cleaner emotional story gains control of the narrative. The label had achieved the one thing the investigation had not. Closure. Sequence restores operating reality. It does not decide guilt. It tells leadership what happened first, what followed, what changed, and what evidence belongs to each separate issue. That is why close-up analysis is the primary direct action tool for this mailbag. Close-up analysis is not about staring harder at one person. It is about breaking a complicated situation into its component parts so the leader can inspect the relationship, sequence, evidence, ownership, and change points that a broad label would hide. The broad label says Maya and Derek are having a workplace conflict. The close read says there may be premature case closures, an unclear procedure, a corrective conversation, a denial, a personal attack, a counter-complaint, possible witness pressure, possible retaliation, and an institutional response problem. That is a completely different operating picture. The leader does not need to decide everything during the first meeting. The leader does need to preserve the conditions required for a defensible decision. First, stabilize the immediate condition. Before leadership gets pulled into competing stories, it has to determine whether there is a live risk involving safety, fraud, compliance, customer harm, financial reporting, evidence destruction, employee welfare, harassment, or operational continuity. In Maya's situation, that means controlling the customer case risk. The affected cases may need to be reviewed. The closure procedure may need temporary clarification. Records and audit trails may need to be preserved. Another manager may need to oversee the review so Maya and Derek cannot shape the evidence environment. That is not a final finding of guilt. It is containment. A leader can protect the operation without deciding the entire case prematurely. Second, preserve the original issue in one neutral sentence. The reported issue is whether customer cases were closed before the required work was completed. That sentence becomes the control point. Every interview, document request, and decision should remain connected to it until the organization can answer it. Do not allow the question to mutate into, is Maya difficult to work with? Do not allow it to become, does Derek feel respected? Those questions may be relevant. They are not substitutes for the original question. A complaint that is not preserved can be quietly displaced. Third, separate the event streams. Leadership may need separate records or separate investigative questions for the original conduct, the supervisor's response, the counter-complaint, possible retaliation, witness pressure, immediate operating risk, and communication concerns. Separate does not mean disconnected. Evidence may overlap. One witness may speak to several issues. Timing may connect them. Separate means one issue cannot erase another. A counter-complaint may be legitimate. It still is not an eraser. If Derek genuinely believes Maya bullied or retaliated against him, identify the exact conduct, dates, words, decisions, witnesses, policy standards, employment actions. Investigate it fairly. Do not use the broad phrase hostile environment as a fog bank that swallows the customer record concern. If Maya behaved improperly, address it. Do not pretend that improper tone proves the case closures were acceptable. That is operating discipline. Fourth, reconstruct the timeline before judging motive. When were the cases closed? What work remained? When did Maya identify the pattern? What records existed before she confronted Derek? When did she speak with him? When did Derek first accuse her of targeting him? When did he tell coworkers that she was retaliating? When was the counter-complaint filed? What changed in Maya's authority, assignments, access, meeting participation, performance review, or reputation after that date? What actions were already planned before the complaint? What actions appeared only afterward? A good timeline does not assume sequence proves causation. It prevents leadership from pretending sequence does not matter. If Derek documented concerns about Maya before the case review, that matters. If no concern appears until the day after she asks him to correct the cases, that also matters. If the explanation for restricting her authority keeps changing, or other supervisors used equally direct language without discipline, those comparisons matter. The timeline is not administrative busywork. It is protection against narrative drift. Fifth, test evidence instead of emotional force. Ask what can be verified, corroborated, or directly observed. Separate interpretation from evidence. Identify what is missing and what information would change the conclusion. Use the organization's approved process. Maintain confidentiality within the limits of that process. Gather the records that reasonably matter. Interview both sides. Interview witnesses separately. Preserve the difference between what someone observed and what someone believes. A fair investigation should not begin with the goal of proving Maya right. It should not begin with the goal of proving Derek right. It should begin with the goal of determining what the evidence supports. That sounds obvious until the organization is under pressure. Then leaders start cutting corners. They interview the person with the stronger emotional claim first and allow that story to frame everything that follows. They ask the reporting supervisor to prove every part of the case while allowing the accused employee to answer with broad character attacks. They disclose the complaint more widely than necessary. They allow witnesses to coordinate stories. They search the supervisor's entire employment history before they secure the records tied to the original event. They call the matter a misunderstanding because a real finding would require a harder decision. That is not neutrality. That is process failure. 6. Control retaliation while the matter is active. Do not wait for an obvious termination. Retaliation can be subtle, cumulative, and operational. Maya is removed from meetings required to do her job. Her authority to assign work disappears. Her decisions require unusual approval. Her schedule changes. Her team is told to bypass her. Minor mistakes that were previously coached become formal discipline. Coworkers hear that she is unstable, unsafe, or not a culture fit. Her performance review suddenly contains concerns that were never documented before. No single action automatically proves retaliation. The stronger read comes from the pattern. Leadership needs to examine when the action occurred, who authorized it, what reason was documented, and whether the same standard was applied before Maya raised the concern. The comparison cannot stop with Derek. Leadership should examine treatment across Maya's team, her peer supervisors, and other comparable employee situations. Compare any change in her assignments, approval authority, meeting access, workload, evaluation, discipline, pay, promotion opportunity, and communication with executives against 3 clear baselines: how Maya was treated before the complaint, how other leaders are treated under similar conditions, and what company policy and normal practice require. The question is not whether one decision feels unfair. The question is whether several observable actions taken together created a measurable departure from normal practice after Maya raised the concern. Any temporary control should have a documented purpose, decision owner, scope, start date, review date, and clear end condition. That leaves less room for guesswork, inconsistent treatment, or a temporary safeguard quietly becoming a penalty. That may mean an independent leader approves any adverse employment action while the matter is unresolved. It may mean changes to Maya's authority are documented and time limited. It may mean witnesses receive a clear instruction against interference, intimidation, and retaliation. This does not give Maya permanent immunity. It prevents a compromise process from determining whether she survives the process. Seventh, correct the substantiated condition and address behavior separately. That sentence needs careful handling. It does not mean leadership ignores immediate dangerous conduct until the investigation ends. If either person threatens someone, destroys evidence, interferes with witnesses, creates a safety hazard, or engages in serious misconduct, leadership controls that behavior immediately. Immediate behavior may require immediate control. It still does not replace the original investigation. If the evidence shows that cases were closed before required work was completed, correct the process, restore the open commitments, clarify the standard, identify who can close a case, what evidence is required, how exceptions are documented, and how prior closures will be reviewed. Then address any legitimate concern involving Maya's conduct. And do not say you were unprofessional. Say what she did, when she did it, what standard applied, what impact it had, and what is expected next. If Derek filed a legitimate complaint, investigate it using the same standard. But do not discipline Maya for creating conflict when the conflict began with an unresolved operating condition and leadership's refusal to separate the issues. Correcting the condition does not excuse bad behavior. It prevents bad behavior from becoming camouflage for the condition. Eighth, make a defensible finding and close each issue clearly. Weak organizations finish these matters with vague language. Communication could have been better. Both parties contributed. Leadership expectations were not aligned. Everyone needs to move forward. Sometimes that is the correct conclusion. Too often it is language used because leadership does not want to say what happened. The investigation gets wrapped in a PowerPoint and buried under communication opportunities. Apparently ambiguity had been promoted to case manager. A defensible closeout identifies the question, the evidence standard, the finding, the corrective action, the owner, the due date, the follow-up requirement, and the protections that remain in place. Some issues may be substantiated, some may be unsubstantiated, some may remain inconclusive, and inconclusive does not mean nothing happened. It means the available evidence did not support a responsible finding. Unsubstantiated does not mean the reporting person acted in bad faith. A report can be made honestly and still not be proven. A counter-complaint can contain a legitimate concern and still be part of a wider attempt to reverse accountability. Reality is allowed to be complicated. The process has to remain clear. Now I want to talk about what happens to the team because senior leaders often underestimate this part. The team is watching. They saw Maya raise the issue. They saw Derek push back. They saw human resources become involved. They saw Maya's authority change. They are reading every decision that follows. If Maya becomes the main subject of investigation, while the closure records disappear into the background, other supervisors learn that direct correction is personally dangerous. Some begin over-documenting every interaction. Others stop correcting behavior unless the problem becomes impossible to ignore. Some avoid high-conflict employees or send every conversation to human resources. The result is not better fairness. The result is leadership paralysis. Employees learn something too. They learn that a counter-complaint may delay accountability. They learn that the standard can become secondary to the emotional force of the response. They learn that the person who creates the strongest escalation may gain control of the process. That does not mean employees should lose the right to complain. It means leadership has to protect that right without allowing the complaint to erase the underlying issue. When leadership mishandles DARVO, managers can become conditioned to stop managing. That is one of the most serious consequences in this entire episode. The organization believes it resolved one conflict. What it may have actually done is teach every first-line leader to look away. Then the standard weakens quietly. Customer failures remain open longer. Documentation becomes inconsistent. Performance conversations become rare. The strongest managers begin leaving because they no longer trust the institution to distinguish accountability from abuse. The organization eventually complains that supervisors lack courage. Leadership trained them not to use it. That is how the human damage becomes an operating failure. This is also where individual DARVO can become institutional DARVO. Institutional DARVO occurs when the organization begins participating in or reinforcing the reversal. The institution does not merely fail to stop the counterattack. Its processes, leaders, investigators, communications, or disciplinary systems begin treating the person who raised the concern as the offender and the person or system under review as the injured party. That transition does not require a secret meeting. It can happen because senior leaders want the issue contained quickly. It can happen because human resources mistakes reduce tension for truth-finding. It can happen because the original operating issue is technical, embarrassing, politically difficult, or connected to someone the organization trusts. It can happen because correcting one supervisor's tone feels easier than admitting the department's performance numbers cannot be trusted. The institution becomes more focused on protecting itself from discomfort than protecting itself from failure. The policy had hired security and was escorting the evidence out. A real-world institutional example is the United Kingdom Post Office Horizon scandal. Faulty accounting data was treated as proof that branch operators had stolen money, while many of the people reporting unexplained discrepancies were accused, prosecuted, financially ruined, or discredited. We should not diagnose every person involved or claim one psychological motive across the institution. The supported operating inference is that the sequence closely resembled institutional accountability reversal. Confidence in the system was protected. People challenging the system were treated as the threat. The institution positioned itself as the victim of wrongdoing by people who were reporting the failure. That is what senior leaders have to understand. An organization can become so invested in defending its system, leaders, reputation, or prior decisions that it starts attacking the information required to correct them. The problem is no longer one person avoiding accountability. The problem is the institution protecting avoidance. I have learned that organizations rarely lose control of these situations in one dramatic moment. They lose control through small permissions. One leader allows the accused person to contact witnesses. Another forwards the complaint to people who do not need it. Human Resources begins a broad review of the reporting supervisor's personality before preserving the original evidence. A senior leader says, "We need to protect the organization," and everyone quietly interprets that as protecting the current leadership structure. A temporary restriction on the supervisor's authority becomes permanent without a finding. No single step feels large enough to stop the process. Then weeks later, the original concern is gone, the supervisor is isolated, the accused person controls the narrative, and leadership says there was never enough evidence. Of course there was not enough evidence. The organization allowed the evidence environment to be contaminated. That is why control has to begin early, not with a public accusation, not with a presumption of guilt, with discipline, separation, preservation, ownership, and review. Now, I want to speak directly to the first-line leader who recognizes themselves in Maya. You did not create the accountability problem by identifying conduct that required correction. You are not automatically retaliating because the employee dislikes the correction. You are not required to abandon a legitimate standard because the person being corrected filed a complaint. You still need to inspect your own conduct honestly. You still need to answer legitimate concerns about your communication, judgment, fairness, or use of authority. You still need to remain open to evidence that changes your understanding. But reflection does not require you to accept a false version of the sequence. You can own a communication mistake without surrendering the original operating concern. You can say, "I understand the concern regarding how I communicated the correction. I will answer that concern directly. The original issue still requires an independent review." That is not defensiveness. That is separation. Your job is not to win the emotional argument. Do not chase every accusation. Do not send a 20-page defense to every person copied on the countercomplaint. Do not diagnose the employee. Do not write, "This is DARVO, therefore I am right." Return to the record. State the original issue in one neutral sentence. Separate the original concern from the countercomplaint. Provide dates, records, witnesses, and the specific decision you are requesting. Confirm verbal direction in writing. Document changes that occur after the complaint, including access, assignments, authority, evaluation, discipline, workload, exclusion, or reputation attacks. I have been accused more times than I can count of being emotionless, angry, heartless, or just a jerk because I am direct. But here is what never changed through any of those accusations. Me. I have lost my temper twice in my professional career, and both times were pretty damn epic. I am not proud of either one. For reference, you could probably have heard me as clearly from a mile away as if I were standing beside you. Both times I walked directly to my leader afterward, owned my lack of professionalism without qualification, and stated that I would accept whatever came with it, up to and including relief from my position. That did not happen, but I did not know that when I accepted responsibility. I reviewed my behavior honestly, identified where I had failed, and owned the consequence. That did not make me a hostile person. It made me human. And those two failures did not suddenly redefine the other million times I had to confront a problem, correct conduct, deliver an uncomfortable truth, or hold a standard without losing control. A real mistake should be examined and owned. It should not be used to rewrite a person's entire character. Now back to the example. Use the authorized reporting and escalation channels. Protect confidential information. Do not remove records you are not authorized to take. Do not interfere with witnesses. Do not exaggerate what the evidence proves. Ask for an independent review when the immediate chain is involved or compromised. Then define your own decision points. What evidence would show that the organization is correcting the problem? What conduct would indicate the process is becoming retaliatory? What channel is primary? What alternate channel exists if the first one fails? What contingency protects your professional standing, health, reputation, and obligations? What emergency condition requires immediate support through an appropriate legal, regulatory, safety, union, licensing, or professional channel? That is where PACE becomes personally important. The primary path may be the normal supervisory and human resources process. The alternate path may be the next leader, ethics office, compliance function, employee relations authority, union representative, or another designated channel. The contingency path may involve reassignment, transfer, professional advice, written boundaries, or an exit decision if the organization has shown that it will not protect a fair process. The emergency path may activate when there is immediate danger, evidence destruction, serious retaliation, or another high consequence condition that cannot responsibly wait. PACE is not about escalating everything. It is about refusing to let one compromised path become your only path. Now, I want to speak to the person making the counter complaint, because there is another side of this that needs just as much discipline. If you have a legitimate concern with your supervisor, raise it. Do not sit on a real problem until the day you are being corrected for something else and then unload 6 months of unresolved frustration into the investigation. As a professional standard, address concerns as close to the event as reasonably possible and at the lowest appropriate level capable of correcting them. If it is a routine disagreement or management concern, deal with it where it can actually be resolved. If the person you would normally report to is involved, the concern is serious, or that path is compromised, use the appropriate alternate channel. There are legitimate reasons people sometimes delay reporting, so timing alone does not decide credibility. But unresolved concerns should not become ammunition stored for the next accountability fight. And leaders, this is where I want you paying very close attention, because there is not one kind of counter-complaint. There are several materially different conditions that can look similar when they first reach your desk. Your job is not to guess which one you have. Your job is to separate them through sequence, specificity, evidence, consistency, comparison, and observable behavior. The first condition is a legitimate countercomplaint. The employee may have done exactly what the supervisor originally reported, and the supervisor may also have done something wrong. Both conditions can exist at the same time. Maybe the performance correction was justified, but the supervisor humiliated the employee publicly. Maybe the employee violated the standard, but discipline was applied differently to comparable employees. Maybe the original conduct is substantiated, and there is also evidence that retaliation occurred afterward. A legitimate countercomplaint normally gives leadership something identifiable to examine. What happened? When? What conduct is being alleged? Who was present? What records exist? And what standard applies? Leadership investigates that complaint on its own evidence without erasing the original accountability issue. The second condition is a mixed or partially supported countercomplaint. This is probably more common than leaders want situations to be because reality does not always arrive in a clean package. The employee may raise 5 concerns and the evidence supports 2 of them. Maybe the supervisor was unnecessarily aggressive, but the allegation of retaliation cannot be established. Maybe inconsistent treatment occurred, but there is no evidence supporting the claim that leadership was deliberately trying to damage the employee's career. Maybe part of the complaint is fact, part is interpretation, and part remains unresolved. Leadership has to be capable of saying exactly that. This allegation is supported, this one is not supported, this one is inconclusive. You do not have to accept or reject the entire complaint as one block. The third condition is a reactive countercomplaint. The employee may sincerely believe they were treated unfairly. The correction hits hard. They feel embarrassed, angry, threatened, defensive, or personally attacked, and they begin looking backward through every interaction with the supervisor. An email from 4 months ago suddenly feels hostile. A scheduling disagreement now looks retaliatory. A supervisor who's always been direct now appears personally motivated. That does not automatically mean the employee is lying. Human beings reinterpret prior events through current experience all the time, but sincere belief is still not the same thing as evidence. Leadership has to separate what the employee experienced, what they now believe it means, and what can actually be established through observable facts. The fourth condition is the strategic or weaponized countercomplaint. This is where the pattern begins, getting much closer to the accountability reversal we are talking about. The person does not meaningfully answer the original evidence. Instead, the conflict expands. The supervisor is hostile. The supervisor is jealous. The supervisor has always targeted them. That old email was inappropriate. That disagreement from 6 months ago now proves a pattern. Somebody else supposedly thinks the supervisor is difficult. Another unrelated issue appears. Then another one. Before long, leadership has 12 accusations, 5 personality judgments, 3 unrelated disagreements, and somehow still does not have an answer to the question that started the entire investigation. That is where accusation volume can fool weak leadership. 10 allegations are not automatically 10 pieces of evidence. Repeating the same accusation 3 different ways does not create corroboration. 3 people saying a supervisor is difficult does not establish what happened during a specific event. An old disagreement does not become proof of retaliation because somebody attached it to the current complaint. Leadership has to make each material allegation stand on its own legs. What specifically happened? When? Who observed it? What record exists? What standard applies? Was the concern documented before the current accountability action? Has the allegation remained materially consistent? What evidence would support it? What evidence would contradict it? And be careful about trying to prove motive. You may never know whether somebody consciously decided to weaponize the complaint process. You do not need to crawl inside their head. Look at the behavior you can actually observe. Does the person answer the original evidence or continually redirect away from it? Do the accusations become broader and less specific as the original evidence becomes stronger? Are unrelated historical events suddenly being assembled into one continuous story? Are witnesses being asked about observable conduct or recruited into character judgments? Does every attempt to return to the original issue produce another accusation? Those are observable patterns. You can assess them without pretending you know exactly what somebody intended. Then there is the fifth condition, and this one does not belong to the employee. It belongs to leadership. Institutional amplification. The counter-complaint may have begun as completely legitimate, partially supported, reactive, or weaponized. Leadership can still turn it into something substantially worse. Human resources combines every issue into one giant workplace conflict investigation. Senior leaders start examining the reporter's entire employment history before securing the evidence around the original complaint. Temporary restrictions quietly become permanent. Personality judgments start receiving the same weight as documented events. Unrelated criticism gets added because somebody remembered it during an interview. The original question becomes harder and harder to find. That is when the institution begins participating in the reversal. And that fifth condition matters because leadership cannot control what allegation arrives, but leadership absolutely controls what it does with the allegation. You can receive a legitimate counter-complaint and mishandle it. You can receive a weaponized counter-complaint and handle it correctly. The organization becomes part of the failure when it abandons sequence, stops distinguishing allegation from evidence, applies inconsistent standards, or allows one complaint to erase another. So if you are the leader receiving this, stop asking only, is the counter-complaint legitimate? That question is too broad. Break it apart. Which allegations are specific? Which are supported? Which are interpretation? Which concerns existed before the accountability action? Which appeared afterward? Which have independent corroboration? Which depend entirely on somebody's opinion of another person's character? Which allegations remain consistent? Which changed as evidence emerged? Which belonged to the original event? Which belonged to a completely different event? And what did leadership itself change after the complaint was raised? The strongest read does not come from timing alone. It does not come from emotion. It does not come from the number of accusations. It does not come from which person has the better title, cleaner presentation, or stronger internal relationships. It comes from sequence, specificity, evidence, consistency, comparison, and observable changes in behavior or treatment. That is how you protect the employee with a legitimate complaint without assuming every allegation is automatically true. It is how you protect the supervisor without assuming every counter-complaint is DARVO. And it is how you keep your own organization from becoming the fifth condition and participating in the reversal it was supposed to investigate. Now to the mid-level manager receiving both complaints. You're not being asked to automatically defend the supervisor. You're being asked to protect the process. The employee deserves to be heard. The supervisor deserves to be heard. The original conduct deserves to be examined. The counter-complaint deserves its own review. What you cannot do is choose the emotionally easier issue because the original one requires a harder decision. Do not call the matter interpersonal conflict before you determine what the conflict is hiding. Do not correct tone and leave the operating condition untouched. Do not allow rank, confidence, distress, popularity, or internal relationships to substitute for evidence. Do not tell first-line leaders to hold people accountable and then abandon them the moment accountability becomes uncomfortable. You may not control every part of the investigation, but you still control what you pass downward. You can keep the original issue visible, require independent review of employment actions, protect witnesses, and give both parties a real process. Standing between senior leadership and the workforce does not mean shielding either side from scrutiny. It means protecting the truth-finding process from distortion. Now, to senior leaders and human resources professionals, this is where I'm going to be direct. If your organization tells first-line supervisors to enforce standards, document performance, protect customers, and raise risk, then punishes them the moment the correction produces a counter-complaint, your system is dishonest. You are asking for accountability in theory and punishing it in practice. If you review the supervisor's entire employment history before securing the evidence tied to the original conduct, you are not being thorough. You are changing the subject. If you use vague language about culture, professionalism, and psychological safety to avoid determining whether the operating standard was violated, you are not protecting people. You are protecting discomfort. If you allow the person under review to shape witnesses, influence the evidence environment, or control the reporter's assignments and reputation, the investigation is already compromised. If you conclude that both parties contributed without identifying what each person actually did, you are using balance as an escape route. And if the organization's response teaches first-line leaders that enforcing a standard can cost them their authority, reputation, and career, do not act surprised when those leaders stop correcting problems early. You created the silence. The warning signs are straightforward. The original question is no longer being asked. The person facing accountability spends more time attacking the supervisor's motives than answering the evidence. A counter-complaint appears immediately after the original concern and is treated as though it cancels the first issue. Leadership reviews the supervisor's entire history while limiting the employee's review to one event. The supervisor's emotional response is treated as proof that the concern lacks merit. The employee uses relationships, access, or internal language to shape the witness environment. The organization moves faster against the supervisor than it moves to control the reported risk. Employment actions begin after the complaint without independent review. The explanation for those actions keeps changing. The institution becomes more focused on reputational protection than factual correction. When you see those signals, do not announce a diagnosis. Tighten the process. Ask what happened first. Ask what evidence existed before the counterattack. Ask which issue is being investigated right now. Ask who owns each issue. Ask what immediate risk must be controlled. Ask what changed after the complaint. Ask whether the same standard is being applied to both people. Ask whether the organization is correcting the condition or containing the person who exposed it. Close-up analysis helps the leader hold those questions apart long enough for the evidence to answer them. It sits inside CSA because the first requirement is a cleaner read. The leader needs to distinguish the visible conflict from the sequence, records, relationships, and decision points underneath it. Pro strengthens the consequence read. Mishandling the matter can damage the reporting person personally, weaken the supervisory role, teach the team the wrong lesson, and expose the organization to wider trust, retention, customer, and legal risk. TMC protects the message and ownership. Who owns the original concern? Who owns the counter-complaint? Who has investigation authority? Who communicates with the parties? Who can authorize employment actions while the matter is active? What follow-through confirms the corrective action actually occurred? PACE protects the next move when the normal reporting chain is involved, compromised, unwilling to act, or unable to control the situation. Those system connections matter because DARVO creates confusion across several levels at once. The primary tool still remains close-up analysis. The purpose is not to decide guilt through a podcast. The purpose is to prevent the wrong story from taking control before the evidence is examined. Bring this back to your own environment. Think about one recent performance correction, complaint, conduct issue, or escalation. What was the original concern? What happened immediately after it was raised? Is that original issue still being examined? Did a counter-complaint replace the original question? What evidence existed before the conflict expanded? What changed after the report? Who now controls the reporting person's assignments, access, authority, evaluation, and reputation? Is leadership correcting the condition or containing the person who exposed it? Those questions do not complete an investigation. They reveal whether the accountability process still belongs to the evidence. The strongest organizations do not prove loyalty by defending every supervisor employee, system, or prior decision. They prove their strength by remaining capable of correction. Both parties receive a real opportunity to respond. Evidence is tested, the counter-complaint is examined. Findings and corrective actions match what is actually established. The standard is not belief without scrutiny. The standard is accountability without reversal. To the first-line leader listening, do not let this experience convince you that leadership itself was the mistake. You may need to change how you document. You may need to slow down difficult conversations. You may need another person present. You may need to clarify expectations before correction. You may need support you did not have. You may discover that part of the complaint against you is valid. Learn from what the evidence shows. But do not allow one reversal to teach you that silence is safer than responsible leadership. And do not stay indefinitely inside an organization that repeatedly asks you to enforce standards while refusing to protect a fair process. Sometimes the organization corrects itself. Sometimes the pattern is the answer. You need the judgment to know which condition you are in. The final point is this. DARVO is not dangerous because the words are clever. It is dangerous because organizations are often ready to accept the reversal. The denial offers relief. The attack offers a new target. The role reversal offers leadership a reason to stop examining the original failure. Do not take that exit. Preserve the complaint. Separate the counter-complaint. Reconstruct the sequence. Protect the evidence. Control retaliation. Correct what the facts support. Then address behavior through its own defensible process. Do not let the person who raises the problem become the organization's new problem. Do not assume guilt because you recognize the pattern. Do not abandon accountability because the pattern makes leadership uncomfortable. DARVO succeeds when leadership allows the counterattack to replace the complaint. Do not let accountability get reversed on your watch. When you are ready to go deeper with close-up analysis and the direct action tools that support disciplined situation reading, go to www.direct-action-system.io/course-directory, open the course directory, find the course connected to the tool, and start there. That is where the deeper application belongs. Thanks for listening to the briefing.